Hi, and welcome to this special summer edition of the AI for Educators Design Lab podcast. I'm Jennifer Maddrell, and if you've been with me through the first half of this season, you know what this series is about. Episode by episode, I've been attempting to unearth the design considerations that come with integrating AI into teaching and learning. These aren't necessarily answers because, as I said back in the very first episode, I view AI integration as an ill-structured design challenge. In that case, there's no single right answer, and what works beautifully in one context might be exactly wrong in another. So instead of answers, this series focuses on what I feel are the highly relevant questions to ponder for yourself, framed within your own context and with your own learners in mind. So this June, I took things beyond diagnosing the pain points, and I facilitated a 4-day design sprint with a cohort of educators. Their backgrounds ranged from K-12, higher education, and professional learning. This podcast has always been about surfacing and examining the design consideration. But in contrast, the design sprint was my first attempt to walk alongside a group of educators as they applied those considerations. Each person redesigned a real learning experience from their own practice. So in today's episode, this is my recap of that experience. And more importantly, a chance for me to share the core ideas underneath what I hope to accomplish. But first, I want to share some broader thoughts about where we are with AI integration. I recently saw on LinkedIn that David Wiley referred to the need to redesign our learning experiences in the age of AI as what he called pedagogical deferred maintenance. And immediately that term resonated with me. Here's what I see as the thinking behind that phrase. When AI arrived in our classrooms, it felt like a crisis that came out of nowhere. Suddenly, students could generate essays, solve problem sets, and produce polished submissions in minutes. And our first instincts were understandably focused on the technology itself. How do we detect AI? How do we ban it? Can we somehow outrun it? But the more time I've spent with this challenge and the more I watched it play out within the sprint cohort in June, the more convinced I've become of something else. I don't think AI created all of the design problems we're wrestling with. Instead, it's shining a very bright light on many problems that have been quietly sitting in our existing learning experiences. For example, think about what it means when an AI tool can complete your assignment in 5 minutes. It likely signals that the assignment asks learners to create a product. But maybe by focusing on the product of learning, it didn't focus enough on the process of learning. Maybe it never required learners to work through the truly messy parts of thinking about the subject matter. And perhaps it never allowed you to see whether that thinking, the uncertainty, and the struggle were actually happening. So my guess is the gaps we're now seeing in teaching and learning didn't only appear because of the technological advancements of AI. Instead, the technology is making them more visible. And I think this is the pedagogical deferred maintenance David Wiley was talking about. In other words, the challenges were already there. But maybe they were easier to overlook as we focused less on the process of learning and more on evaluating the product of learning. This would include the grades and the test scores. And again, maybe AI is making the impacts of those choices more apparent. So, like the deferred maintenance on a building or your car, there comes a point when continuing to ignore it is no longer an option. AI may have just pushed us to that point. So that's the spirit of today's episode and, frankly, the design sprint. It's not to raise panic about AI, but to instead look at what AI is revealing about the design of our learning experiences. And then, in turn, making decisions about where we are now versus where we want to be. In fact, this isn't even really an episode that's mostly about AI. Instead, it's about the design of learning experiences, something our field has studied for a very long time. And then why this moment is calling us to draw on that knowledge to address teaching and learning in the age of AI. So circling back to the focus of the design sprint and the framing at its center, my aim was to examine what makes learning experiences AI vulnerable and what it takes to make them more resilient. My thesis has long been that it is not simply the presence of AI that creates the vulnerability. It's that many of our learning experiences were designed before AI became a significant design consideration. So as a result, aspects of those experiences may no longer align in the ways they once did. Over the past year, much of my work has focused on surfacing design considerations to help educators respond to that misalignment. For the design sprint, we kept the focus relatively narrow, and we examined 4 connected elements of a learning experience that have long been central to effective teaching and learning. The first element is our learning goals, or what learners should know or be able to do. The second is the learning task, what we as educators and designers ask learners to do to help them achieve those learning goals. Third is the visibility of the learning process, meaning how much of the learner's thinking can we see while it's developing. You might think of this as what we typically call formative assessment. And the fourth is how learning is measured, meaning the evidence we use to decide whether learning happened. This is what we might think of when we think about summative assessment and what ultimately carries the grade. Again, none of these 4 elements of a learning experience are new. The alignment of goals, tasks, and assessment is what we've always aimed for in designing learning experiences. Formative assessment has always focused on making learning visible so that we can offer guidance and feedback. And guiding principles for summative assessment have long suggested that we should examine authentic performance and learner judgment, not just finished products. So what I'm saying is I'm not forwarding a new approach to designing instruction in the age of AI. Instead, I'm asking you to go back to the basics and reconsider 4 connected elements of a learning experience that our field has long associated with effective teaching and learning. Again, this being the learning goals, the learning task, the visibility of the learning process, and the evidence used to measure learning. And then to think about how AI impacts them. And again, while the elements themselves are not new, what is new is the need to examine how AI affects each one and whether they still work together in ways that allow us to see and support the learning we value. Let me now take a moment to illustrate how that misalignment can play out using my own assignment example from the design sprint. I redesigned this assignment right alongside the cohort of educators who enrolled. I've talked about this assignment before on the podcast, but to give you a bit of background, I assign an annotated bibliography in one of my college classes. Students find 8 to 10 scholarly sources, they provide citations, and then write annotations that summarize each source. They're asked to evaluate its quality and then connect it to their own research question. Before the design sprint, I took my assignment instructions and gave them to Claude. And I asked Claude to complete the assignment in a way a student might. Not surprisingly, in less than 5 minutes, I had a fluent, correctly formatted, and highly convincing submission. The evaluations were somewhat generic, and the relevant statements read as a bit templated, and a few of the citations looked completely real but were not from the top-tier journals I would have preferred. But at the end of the day, a student could have submitted this and earned a perfectly acceptable grade with less than 5 minutes of AI prompting. So what is happening here? Where are things breaking down? Well, follow the chain within the learning experience. While deep down I may have wanted students to learn how to evaluate and judge a body of research, my task really was only asking for a finished product, one that it now turns out AI can generate quickly. And unfortunately, my students' learning and thinking processes were always invisible to me in this assignment. I received one document, submitted once, so I never really saw or could verify with any certainty what anyone had read or evaluated. And my measurement of their learning rested entirely on that final, polished artifact. So notice how AI's ability to produce that final, polished artifact was viewed as the problem in examples like this. But the learning aims and the process I genuinely valued were always buried. Unfortunately, I had allowed the product to stand in for the process and the evidence of learning. I assumed that if the product looked good, then the learning process must have worked. But in reality, the student's learning was never visible to me while it developed, and it was never something I could clearly attribute to the student. So that's what AI vulnerable means to me now. It's not simply that AI exists to complete the learning task. It's that chain connecting the learning goals, the learning task, and the visibility of that learning process to then the evidence used to measure learning may no longer be relevant or aligned. And while this may seem bleak, there's something hopeful buried in that diagnosis. If relevance and misalignment are part of the problem, then redesign is the path forward. And the good news is design work is what our field already knows how to do. And I think it's also important to say here that redesign does not always mean rebuilding the entire learning experience. As we saw in the design sprint, sometimes that means identifying the one place where the chain is breaking and making one or two thoughtful design responses. And one important caution before we move on, though, is this comes directly from how I framed this series from the beginning. Redesign does not look the same for everyone. Because AI integration is an ill-structured design challenge, what alignment looks like for a graduate research course will look different from a high school science class, which in turn will look different from a corporate compliance module. However, these 4 connected elements I mentioned earlier give us a shared basis for examining the learning experience. Yet they do not give us one shared answer. The decisions still depend on you, your context, and your learners. And that's exactly why every participant in our design sprint worked on a learning experience from their own practice rather than a common case study. The process and the design considerations were shared, but the design decisions were theirs. So let me now pivot and talk a little bit about how we structured that design work in the design sprint. We followed a design process model called the Double Diamond. If you're not familiar with it, it takes you through 4 phases of design: discover, define, develop, and deliver. In plain terms, that means you first diagnose the problem. Then you clarify what a design needs to accomplish. Next, you generate and then weigh possible responses. And only then do you decide what to implement and how you will know whether it worked. Our participants in the design sprint moved through 4 design sessions I structured across the week. We captured their thinking in a working brief we called the Design Decisions Document. And I'll admit I really love that name because it carries a lot of the idea I'm trying to convey. Design really is a process of decisions made throughout. And that document existed to make those decisions visible and deliberate. And looking back at the whole experience, if I had to name the single most important takeaway of the whole process, it would be this: diagnose before you solve. The pull towards solutions is strong, and I watched it all week and even in my own work as I think about AI integration. The moment we sense a vulnerability, we want to reach for a fix. That might be adding an oral exam or requiring a draft, maybe banning the AI tool or hiring proctors. And I understand that pull to solve, and I felt it myself. But a redesign built on an undiagnosed problem is really just a hope. You're hoping that your guess at a solution is correct. So everything in the sprint started with what I call the AI vulnerability test. You take your real assignment instructions and then prompt an AI tool the way a student might. You then look at what comes back, and you ask yourself a really hard question. If a student submitted this, what would I know about their learning? And only after sitting with that answer and examining what you found can you begin to name the problem and start the redesign. And while the diagnosis part of the sprint is a rich story in itself, I really want to spend time on the redesign work itself. Once participants had diagnosed the problem, they considered a range of possible design responses. Their goal was not to apply as many responses as possible, but instead to address specific points of misalignment by choosing evidence-based responses as part of the redesign. So during their developed design sessions, the participants worked from a design response handout we built together. It included a collection of possible design moves organized around the 4 connected elements of the learning experience. We then tried to tie each design response to the theory and research behind it. And I really do want to reiterate that these responses were potential starting points, not prescriptions. They were there to spark possibilities, but not to give everyone the same steps to follow for AI integration. And again, the aim was not to tear apart the whole learning experience and start from scratch or consider every conceivable redesign option. It was to identify the problem you had and choose a response that was both educationally meaningful and realistic within your setting. So in that same spirit, I'd like to walk through the 4 elements now and share an example design response within each one. And if you can, it might be really helpful to hold your own AI vulnerable learning experience in mind as we go. So let's start with the learning goals. The diagnostic question here is fairly simple to ask, yet possibly uncomfortable to answer. The question is, do your current goals still represent what learners should know or be able to do now that AI exists? As in the example with my course, one possible design response is to shift goals from finding information toward verifying and judging it. This means looking into the relevance, credibility, and overall quality of the information. While this might not be applicable to all learning experiences, so much of our goal language was written in an era where locating and reproducing information were significant parts of the learning task. But now AI can do much of that part of the learning task, and as we know, sometimes impressively or sometimes with confident fabrication. So that signals many of our learning aims may now increasingly involve information, verification, and judgment. And I know that rewriting learning goals scares a lot of educators. It can feel like we're shifting or even lowering the bar on what we should be covering just because students now have access to AI. But I would argue that focusing on the relevant cognitive work is not really lowering the bar. Instead, it acknowledges the reality that AI is now in our lives, and it involves bringing our learning goals into line with what our learners truly need to know and do in today's world, which is frankly something we should have cared about all along. And this response rests on well-established ground. Our instructional design tradition has long argued that goals should specify the enduring knowledge and the required doing in authentic performance, rather than merely content coverage. And moving on to the second element that we covered in the design sprint is the learning task. Here, the diagnostic question is more pointed. If learners use AI as part of their current learning task, is it more likely to support their thinking or quietly replace it? One possible response is to anchor the learning task to the learner's own question, context, or data. The reasoning here is that a learning task built around locally specific material, whether that's the learner's classroom, organization, community, or evolving research, is harder to satisfy with generic AI output. This is because generic output is precisely what these tools produce most easily. So this connects us to a long tradition in our field of designing around authentic problems. These kinds of authentic tasks resist the canned answers that AI can more easily create. And now moving on to the third element we considered is the visibility of the learning process. The diagnostic question here is this: can you observe the learner's thinking as it develops, or is their learning visible only as a single polished product at the end? And I would say that during the sprint, this was the element where I saw the most light bulb moments. One possible response is to stage the work so that some of the learner's earlier thinking becomes visible before they submit a final artifact. And that can come in a lot of different forms. It might be a brief rationale explaining why they selected a particular source. Or it might be rough reading notes that are deliberately unpolished. It might be a checkpoint draft that receives brief feedback from the instructor. Each one of these examples creates a visible record of development, and just as importantly, a moment when you can actually teach. And this is the point of formative assessment. The research base here is enormous and decades deep. Hundreds of studies suggest that making learning visible during instruction and responding to it can substantially improve achievement. So while AI might be making formative assessment more necessary, it's always been a good idea. And what AI is highlighting is how much it costs us to skip it. And now the fourth and final element we considered in the design sprint is how learning is measured. The diagnostic question here sits where so much of our academic integrity anxiety lives. The question is, can learning achievement and the evidence used to judge it currently be attributed to the learner when AI is in the mix? And while a common design response is often better AI detection, we took a different approach that instead reconsidered what evidence carries the grade. Therefore, a possible response could be to shift some of the weight away from the final product and toward that learning process evidence we talked about a moment ago. So if you've used notes, drafts, one-on-one meetings, or reflections to enhance the learning process, you could let those contributions count more toward the final grade. This approach means that polish on the final submission will have less influence on the final grade. This is really important because fluent writing can be AI generated, and we have no way of actually knowing if learning took place. So as a result, you can place more emphasis on the quality of judgment and the evidence used rather than the fluency of expression. As I wrap up this design sprint recap, I've clearly covered a lot of ground. So let me try to bring this together with a few key takeaways. While AI is clearly bringing new opportunities and risks to teaching and learning, many of the pain points we're pinning on AI may actually be signals of challenges that were already there. As I've tried to argue throughout this episode, those challenges are often what makes a learning experience AI vulnerable. During the design sprint, we examined that vulnerability through 4 connected elements. Again, the learning goals, the learning task, the visibility of the learning process, and finally, the evidence used to measure learning. Making a learning experience more AI resilient means examining whether those elements are still relevant and whether they're aligned now that AI is in the mix. And I cannot stress enough that none of these elements is new. They draw on ideas our field has carried for decades, including constructive alignment, formative assessment, and authentic measurement. And I sound like a broken record here, but what is new is the need to reconsider how they work together under a changing set of conditions. And because AI integration is an ill-structured design challenge, that realignment work will look different depending on your context and your learners. So what I feel I'm offering here are the relevant questions to consider, possible design responses as starting points, and then a read on the evidence beneath them. And so the decisions themselves on what to do remain with you. And I really wanted to make sure that I acknowledge the design sprint focused deliberately on only 4 key elements. I did so because they do carry a great deal of weight in the design of a learning experience. However, it's equally important to acknowledge that these are only part of the larger AI integration challenge. And this podcast series is where I continue to unearth the rest. This includes things like data privacy and security, AI literacy, and designing for human presence in AI integrated learning. So as the regular season of the podcast picks up again this fall, please join me as I dig into more of these design considerations. And if you'd like to work through this full design process with your own AI vulnerable learning experience, the complete design sprint is now available as a self-paced experience. You can find links to the podcast, the on-demand version of the design sprint, and all of our current offerings at nextpathdesign.com/join. The on-demand design sprint includes all 4 design sessions. You'll have access to the design decisions document that structures the diagnosis and redesign, the recorded live sessions from the June cohort, and the full design response handout I mentioned before. That handout currently includes roughly 30 possible responses, and they're organized around the 4 connected elements I spoke of, and they're anchored to the research behind them. What I shared with you today are just some examples to get you thinking. But it's really the design sprint where you'll sit down and work through the design decisions yourself. Again, I'm Jennifer Maddrell, and this has been a special summer edition of the AI for Educators Design Lab podcast. Thank you for spending part of your summer with me, and I'll be back again when the podcast returns this fall.